We're going to turn to our current-
Regularly scheduled
not so
program.
current. Okay. All right, let's, as we begin, we remember tomorrow is 9/11. And I'm not sure of the details here. I left 4 of my elders in the World Trade Center on 9/11. And actually were regarded as one of the worst days of my life. And nothing bad happened to me. It was what was happening to everybody else. So we remember that anniversary. I suggested this book because of the election year. And of course, tonight is the debate, which probably is consequential for the elections to come. So there's lots to pray over. Let's pray. Good and gracious God, for the blessing of this day, we give you thanks and praise. Be with us in this day, that we remember with thanksgiving those who served and loved their country, for those who wish to serve, and for all of us who need to make decisions. We pray for wisdom and kindness and compassion in our leaders and in ourselves. So be with us now as we regard this book and this unfinished love story, a love story of a nation, and help us to play our part in fulfilling that promise. In Christ's name, we dare to pray it, and all God's people said,
Amen.
hey, as we start, first of all, like the book, hate the book, like it. It's very readable. Yeah, very. I think, one of the reasons I suggested in the book is Doris Kearns Goodwin is professor of presidential history at Harvard University. And when I was doing my doctorate, every summer there are the Goodwin scholars. And I think we were the 3rd or 4th year. I happened to be pregnant that summer. And Doris Kearns Goodwin asks people at, like, in my case, Columbia University and other places that are doing PhDs in economics, religion, cultural anthropology, so that you all come together. And she's a presidential historian, and she's a riot. I mean, on President's Day, turn on your television at 7:30 in the morning. She'll be on some channel. It's her happiest day. It's President's Day. Yay! And I mean, she talks about, like, Millard Fillmore. Nobody else knows anything about Millard Fillmore. So, well, Millard Fillmore also, his favorite color was blue, and he would whatever. I mean, and she's just incredible. Anyway, I think there were 12 of us, either 10 or 12, I don't recall. And so we were in Cambridge for 6 weeks, and but it was really fun because we would talk about, for instance, FDR. She'd say, Lindner, what was going on in religion in those years? Or Thompson, what was going on in economics in those? And you get this whole sort of composite, which was really, I mean, if you're kind of nerdy, it was a lot of fun. But she and Mr. Goodwin, I didn't call him Dick. I mean, I was a student. I called her Dr. Goodwin. I called him Mr. Goodwin. Had us over for dinner, and I was, and he had this sort of lion head. I mean, this unruly hair, she said. And it kind of a rough persona. But the first night we were there, he was making drinks for people, and he said, well, what would you like to drink? And I said, no, I'm pregnant. I'm just something. So I'll make you a Virgin Mary, a Bloody Mary, but without alcohol. And he remembered it all the time we were there. He never again asked me if I wanted, but I thought that was sort of a courtesy, and so And there were some other people in the book. Bill and Judith Moyers were good friends are good friends. And Samuel DeWitt Proctor and Sergeant Shriver, who were at the Peace Corps, who are also friends. So to me, this is also a walk with some of my running buddies. But let me start with this. Where were you when John Kennedy was assassinated?
7th grade English class.
7th grade English,
Mhm.
all right.
7th grade art class, getting hollered at because I was at the wrong table and screwing around.
Why am I not?
And the funny thing is, I was at my future sister-in-law's table and I had no idea. She reminded me of it.
And what school were you in?
Riverdale,
Riverdale?
Riverdale Junior High School.
Union, Kwame Junior High School.
Min.
I was a sophomore at St. Mary's Catholic School in South Amboy.
Mhm.
I was 7th grade at Ann Street, it was grammar school at that point, so I went through 8th. And it's like it was yesterday,
Mhm.
you know, there's certain things just stick in your head and.
I was in 9th grade German class.
I had already graduated from college. And ironically, I was target shooting in the woods with my boyfriend.
All right.
Yeah.
Doctor's test. Longer. Said he would come.
It is the way of things.
This is the reward in seeing all of it.
And do we need to prepare?
That's one right
Well, coming.
And there's one here.
there. No, it's one right there.
Right there.
I can move it.
All right, thank you, Tom. Nancy, we're just beginning, so you haven't missed a thing. And please help yourself to a treat. And and I'm asking people where they were at the time of the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, so I had graduated from college. I was in the woods target shooting with my boyfriend at the time. And then we got done target shooting, we got back in the car, and that's when we heard the news.
I was in geometry.
Nancy, where were you?
We had gone into the army and we were in Killeen, Texas. And I heard my husband.
So you
was
were
in the
right
army.
sort of at the beginning of the.
And I remember waking up my daughter and saying, Chris, the president was shot, and she was too young to understand. that we were in the army and close to it.
Wow, that's good. I was in typing class in Willowbrook High School in Illinois.
So, a lot of us were in school, except for our Pistol Pete over here. This is an image that doesn't quite square in my mind, but all right, we all have both. Yes, indeed we do. So just to ask that question, where were you? And will you ever forget where you were? You know, you say, where were you when the Yankees won the World Series? I don't know.
Which one?
But you know, you don't know. But that, will you ever forget? No, you will never forget. And so in some ways, this book is an account, a progressive or liberal Democrat account, but nonetheless an account of that time that we can refer to in the aggregate as the 60s. Now, in fact, in some ways, one could argue that the 60s didn't start till 1963 and they ended in 1973. In other words, they really began in earnest with the assassination of John Kennedy and ended at the retreat from Vietnam. And in some ways, that's true. In history, in formal history doing, we call it periodization. And so when we say the 60s, historians usually go back to 59 and go forward to about 76. And they do that because you have to account for that 1960 campaign. Let me take you back now to 1960. what memory, if any, do you have of the Nixon Kennedy election? Any?
Oh, I did.
Yes, please.
I remember watching it on TV with my mother. And saying. "I vote for Kennedy, and it was because he was young
And cute.
and cute.
Well, right, we get that. How about you, Crystal?
I was actually in my college glee club. And Nixon was campaigning in Philadelphia, where I went to school outside of Philadelphia, and we all had to sing, a whole bunch of schools were forced to sing in the Voices for Nixon choir.
Hmm.
So
Where were you in school?
it was then Beaver College now.
Oh,
so I
Beaver
came
College,
to
yeah, right, right.
University.
Right.
Presbyterian Women's College back then.
Yeah, I know Beaver College well, yeah, good.
I don't remember the debates, but I remember, my mother was, same reason, she was gonna vote for Kennedy because he's so cute. And my mother was Catholic, my father was nothing at the time, but, I had a nickel bet with my father that Kennedy was gonna win, and he bet Nixon was gonna win, so I remember that. And I remember the inauguration very vividly, it was freezing cold, snowing out, and,
Mm.
I had just fallen into the creek, so I came home soaking wet and freezing. So, but I remember the inauguration more than anything else, and, one black and white little TV.
Right, and the podium caught fire while Robert Frost was. You're saying.
Stumbling through his poem.
Yes. Exactly. Well, I lived in Bucks County, I mean, I was a kid, I was 11 years old. And we had a snowstorm. And my mother was concerned because the electricity was out. And then it just, you know how it flickers and then it comes on. And because her children, you know, it was inauguration day, so there's no school or. It's, the prospect of having children home all day with no heat and no electricity probably was a grim thought. And then she planted us all in front of the television to watch the inauguration. Other thoughts about the election?
No.
My family were all Republicans. My grandfather had been appointed by a judge by a Republican. What I remember is they did traffic in the idea, and if he's elected, the Pope will run this country. And and now knowing what I know about popes and countries, no, but it tells you about an era, right? I mean, the first anything, woman, Catholic, black, whatever, raises.
Fear tactic.
Well,
Or
both
I think a
concerns,
lot.
both real and imagined, I
Right.
think. And so that's what I remember. And then I have a vague memory of watching the debates. And I don't know why. I don't remember thinking John Kennedy was cute. I don't remember that. But I remember thinking that Nixon looked scary. Somehow he looked kind of dark and ferocious. Ferocious is probably better. So it didn't appeal to me.
My grandfather was a big Democrat. But she loved.
Yeah, I think
Nixon,
so.
And she voted for him then, and she voted for him when he became president. She thought he was wonderful.
We saw Doris Kearns Goodwin over the weekend. I don't remember what
Sunday,
show it
was a
was.
early Sunday show.
Iron one.
Okay, maybe, yeah, yeah.
And she was talking about the debates, about the Kennedy
Nixon,
debate.
yeah, yeah.
And Nixon had just come out of the hospital for 10 days or something like that. He was sweating profusely because he was sick.
And he just bumped his knee that
He just bumped his knee that he had problems with because it got infected, and
So
he
he was-
refused to have any makeup on. So that was, and I think they said if you polled the radio people, Nixon won. If you polled the television people, Kennedy
Interesting.
won.
Yeah, that's what he just said.
Interesting.
I mean, right?
Well, I just wanted to kind of orient us to our own lives in relation to this book. Now let's talk about the book. What are your initial impressions? Pat said something I thought was interesting. She said, yeah, I'm not really interested in politics, but I enjoyed reading the book. What are some other thoughts?
Thought on the Johnson part was, in my mind, I thought he was a terrible president, but that was the Vietnam version of it.
Of course.
Because my brother died, you know, he was going to be, he enlisted, but he was going to be drafted. Craig's draft number was the only draft, the only lottery he ever won. And he didn't- They messed up on his physical, but, so that's what I remember of Johnson. I didn't remember all this other stuff that he had done, which was incredible.
Right.
So this book redeemed Lyndon Johnson in your eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
He carried on the stuff that Kennedy started, but never finished. And they even said, I think in this book, maybe it was Doris Kearns doing it again, I don't know. That Kennedy was not really overly interested in civil rights. I mean, he did notice at his inauguration that when the Coast Guard went by, there wasn't one black face in that Coast Guard, and he made mention of that.
Mhm.
And of course, you know, it's like when a boss says, "How many red cars are made?" Somebody's out scurrying to find out how many red cars are made so that they can please the boss, kind of deal. So, but I think that he carried out the stuff that didn't didn't happen. And the transition between Richard Goodwin, you know, adoring Kennedy, and Doris adoring Johnson, and there was they had like arguments over it, you know.
That's a really good point. An important subtext of this book, an important subtext of their lives and relationship is the Kennedy versus Johnson administration, the torque in those two. And that's a very present reality in their home. There's like a wall of Kennedy books and there's a wall of Johnson books.
Felt like Kennedy was new, he was a young senator, and Johnson had been there. He developed these relationships. So therefore, and he knew how Congress really worked. So when it came time to put the bill through, he knew who to go through, he knew how to do it. And I think
Absolutely.
that was-
But one of my friends that I was mentioning earlier, Sergeant Shriver, who was the head of the Peace Corps, and Samuel DeWitt Proctor, who's a black pastor who was the deputy director of Peace Corps, were friends of mine later on. And Sarge Shriver used to say, no one since Sam Rayburn has had the mastery of the Congress like Lyndon B. Johnson, that he knew how to work the room, he knew how to count. And I think in contemporary, Nancy Pelosi is like that.
Mhm.
Nancy knows how to count. And if she says, we're ready for a vote, you can take that to bank. If she says, we're not ready to vote yet, that means she doesn't have the votes and don't even try. And I think that's a mastery that Kennedy did not enjoy. And I think you're right also that in a philosophic way, John Kennedy was committed to civil rights, but didn't have the passion kind of for it that others did. And where did Lyndon Johnson's passion for the civil rights movement come
From
from?
when I was a teacher.
Exactly.
And
in
mostly
Koala,
Mexican kids.
Texas, and teaching Mexican.
Minority.
He was also a man of, kind of poor
Or he was dirt poor,
Texan, yeah, folk. And so he knew, I mean, that's another great contrast. I mean, John Kennedy, literally born with a silver spoon. Johnson, no. And so when one could acknowledge it philosophically, and one could have the passion, and that may be, in logic, we say that something is necessary or a proof is necessary. Sometimes we say it's necessary but not sufficient. But when you have both necessary and sufficient, then you've got a proof.
Right.
Well, it may be that Kennedy and Johnson together proved the necessary and sufficient. But neither one would have, long, whatever they,
But if Kennedy had not been killed, I mean, I know they said Johnson picked it up and passed all this, so that was all good. But do you think that Kennedy would not have? Had he not been killed? I mean, I guess it's hard to know,
Well-
it's just speculation, but
well, but let's play that out. I think he would, especially. And Doris, I don't know about Mr. Goodwin or Dick. But Doris would absolutely say. That before you credit Lyndon Johnson, you credit. Those who walked in front of fire hoses and dogs and across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and John Lewis and, I mean, you. I think Kennedy would have responded to the growing pressure of the civil rights movement. But because he took Johnson as a running mate as political expediency, he didn't take him because this is like somebody with whom I share.
Mhm. Right.
and he should pull it back,
Right.
Yeah.
which I never realized, yeah.
Yeah, well, but would he have had the grace? Would his administration, with the smart Ivy League boys, have had the grace to know that sitting it down the West Wing in the vice president's office was the guy who could make the thing pass? Or would they have just butted heads? Because they would never have had the votes to pass the civil rights.
Well, Bobby Kennedy was an example. He did everything he could to be negative to Johnson.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely, that was. Yeah, and Bobby Kennedy himself. Much more so than his brother, I think. I mean, you know, he worked with, on the Estes Kefauver stuff and had worked with Cone. And was kind of a headstrong, headlong. Not a lot of grace notes in Bobby Kennedy, but a great deal of passion. All right, what else?
I thought about the counsel that Johnson received when he was considering the vice presidency. I don't remember who just said it, but you know, why would you give up the most powerful job in the nation, Speaker of the House, Speaker of the Senate, to have the least powerful job in the
Yeah.
entire United States? And you know, I don't know. It still not bothers me, but confuses me as to why he took the position. I knew why Kennedy needed him, because he needed the South vote. But and also when Kennedy was assassinated, he was down there because his numbers were going down and down and down and down. He was trying to revive his numbers, and it didn't work out so good. But that was one thing I just saw, going from a very powerful position to almost a nothing position.
And why do you think he did it?
I don't know. He certainly didn't do it because he thought he'd be president someday. I don't think that was ever on his scope of things. I think he loved the Congress. He loved what he was doing. He loved the going back and forth and fighting and all that. So I don't know.
Maybe he thought that he could have some influence on Kennedy as far as working with the Congress is concerned. Since he had that experience and he knew Kennedy did not.
Yeah, I think now, one comes to an opinion from the things you read, and I've read Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about LBJ. Lyndon is that book. I've never read his memoir, which she sort of quoted too. That's really odd to be writing both sides of the, you know, it's like playing both sides of the chessboard. But anyway, I think we have to kind of roll our memories back. This is post-war. All the adults in the room in this era have essentially fought in a terrible war. It's been followed by a kind of a startling realization by the Americans that they're the most powerful nation in the world and the richest. And the economy is booming. that Eisenhower put in the interstate highways, the cars, jobs, colleges, I mean, booming, 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 booming. Doris Kearns Goodwin in Linden, at least, suggests that Johnson's decision to leave majority leader in the Senate. It doesn't come bigger than that. Think Mitch McConnell in these days. To be vice president. Was he saw, essentially, there are two Americas. One is prospering and getting, expanding in every way you can think of, intellectually, socially. The other is languishing.
Same as today.
And he thought that Kennedy would not pay attention to those who were languishing unless he had somebody in that slot that kept it before him. He also thought that Kennedy made too much. Eisenhower was elected president because he was a very famous general, not because he had some qualification other than that. I mean,
Oh, he looked like my grandfather.
I remember,
But that was why one would vote for him.
well, there's that. Yeah, he looked like my grandfather too now that you mention it. But he was a general. And of course, PT 109, Kennedy was a veteran with a notable and heroic service. And Johnson always felt a little, regretful maybe, that he had not been in service. And that he thought that General Eisenhower had brought different skills to the leadership of the presidency than John Kennedy did. And that what he brought was charisma and fame and money and good looks, but inexperience. And so he thought, in other words, Johnson took that job for dedication to country. That the country needs this service that I have now, not in this role, but in this role. That's what she says in Linden.
The other thing I found interesting was that the invasion of Cuba was actually started in the Eisenhower administration. And Kennedy could have stopped it, and he didn't. And that was a negative on his.
Yeah, well, it's almost a true calamity. Yeah.
A lot of this brought back college memories, of course. And when Kennedy came on and the Cuban Missile Crisis thing, to say that they were going to go in, maybe invade Cuba and all that. I remember all of us sitting in a common room where the TV was and terrified that, you know, fathers, brothers, boyfriends, uncles, anybody, any male was going to get called up to war. And we were going to have another war. We were all terrified of that. I remember specifically.
One of the things I remember about this whole election time, this family of Republicans that I come from. My mother had 3 sisters, and all the aunts were fascinated by Jackie Kennedy. They didn't much care about the election. But fascinated. And do you remember she did a tour of the White House? Well, all the aunts and all the girl cousins.
Later in her life, she lived quite close to us. And she used to walk on the road. She was married to somebody else and living in Far Hills. Was that Far Hills?
Yeah.
Okay.
She used to do a fox hunting.
Her
and-
horse riding. Bedminster, peacock, yeah,
She would
yeah.
just to walk
Yeah.
on the roads.
Yeah,
Just
I
by
remember that,
herself.
yeah.
and She'd just
Yep.
be there.
Yeah.
She was part of
Yeah.
it. Sorry.
But.
Yeah,
but
That's right. She had a lot.
As what we're doing is we're reweaving the tapestry of the sixties here as we
Reliving
talk.
our life.
And there is that strain, I mean. Who knows? I think in those days, probably the aunts voted however the uncles voted, right? I mean, I don't know,
Mhm.
but, they. I mean, Mamie Eisenhower just didn't have the panache, you know, that. I mean, they liked, my family liked that Camp David was named Camp David for Eisenhower's grandson. And the Eisenhowers had a farm in Gettysburg, so
Obviously.
it felt like this is hometown boy makes good, you know. So, I mean, they
Well,
felt
we're
an
really from
attachment.
Kansas, but yeah.
Well,
Yeah. But
Yeah.
you know how that works,
Yep.
right? It's like all the places Washington slept, well,
Yeah.
somebody started on up and he was 3 times as old as he. Watched the baby. If he slept all those places, just one night.
Interesting, in Newport at Fort Adams, there's the Eisenhower House, and he would go there and stay also.
Well, and see, that's how it happens, so then people around that area get an attachment to that person. So, all right, so now, let's go to the substance of this book. What set Goodwin and Goodwin, Doris and Richard on this quest?
Boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes
300
of
boxes.
stuff. Yeah,
Talk about a rat.
but he had cool stuff. I
All
had
good,
junk.
all
Yeah.
good stuff.
Yeah, it is cool. stuff.
Every document, I mean, what a history. That is.
And he
amazing.
sloughed some of it off like, you know, that was
There's
just
no
one of my
big deal,
speeches.
right, and.
Wow.
Well, and the baton from the Pettit.
Yeah.
Personal letters from, you know, different people at Kennedy.
Mhm.
And just to give you an idea, think of Dick Goodwin. Think of Bob Menzies, if you think of
Mhm.
Bob Menzies, who is, that's kind of the size and shape of him. And Min is about the size of Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Yeah.
So there's like this small building and then this petite lady. But when they get into a discussion, I mean, they're both towering intellects. And his command of the English language, even just talking, is, you want to take notes, you know, it's just when he's. I remember they had a garden in back, they lived in the town of Concord. And so we had a little ride from Cambridge over to Concord. And they have gardens in the back. And he was telling us that I like plants, I enjoy them, but they're not my friends, you know, I don't know their names. I think flowers are pretty, but I don't really know much about them. Well, he knew all the names. And he would walk us, this gigantic man would take this little tiny flower in his hand and not pull it off the bush, just put his fingers, and this is the blah, blah, and in Latin it's blah, 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 and this blooms 3 times a year. That's very unusual, 3 times. I mean, one of those things that like, does that brain ever stop? I mean, did you ever just rest? And I think that answer is no.
Well, he just seems like he was consistently restless,
Yeah.
like just leaving college and going off and joining the service.
Yeah.
That just seemed like it was a whim thing, so, you know.
No, well, yeah, I think there's a little impulse control problem. I think that's true. So now they have all these boxes. Why did they decide to essentially write a memoir? I mean, there's lots of other things you could do with those boxes. You could sort them out and say, here are some things that should go to the Smithsonian. Here are some things that should go to the Harvard's Peabody collection. here are some things that really ought to go to the recycle center, you know, that, like your name badge from the convention, I think we can part with it now, that's 30 years back.
The things you would think they'd give to the Kennedy Library and the Johnson
Yes.
Library.
Well, I think the way I took it, they were looking at it and getting older, and his impending life was more time in the rearview mirror than in the front of the mirror, so maybe it's time to really start looking at this collective life, and you know, they've both written their own books separately, and
So to make
Just on
sense
the collaborative.
primarily of his life.
yeah, I view this more as his story, not really her story. She was the reporter in this,
Mhm.
but had also participated, you know, during the time as well.
I think she wanted to do it too, so he could reflect on what he had accomplished. You know, and it was so much. I think that was a nice walk back
Yeah.
through and
Yes.
discussing it,
I think they enjoyed the process. of it.
yeah.
That's what I took from it.
Although they did have some tense times.
He said he wanted to know him as a young person. And so they started back in the beginning, then she would see what he was really like
Mhm.
when he was younger. I thought it was amazing, he started journaling and kept all those journals. It was
Absolutely.
unbelievable to be able to read those, and I'm sure for Doris, like you're saying, Jane.
And that's another visual difference. Mr. Goodwin always looked like sort of like an unmade bed. And
Warranty.
no, I mean, like the novice tie, instead of being up here, it's like here. You know? I mean, just kind of just walk.
He's too busy, yeah.
And Doris is very, as she is today, very well turned out. In fact, we had a little joke that I can't remember what happened now. Maybe it was a fire alarm or something. But we were in our seminar. We were fellows, so it wasn't like it was a class or something like that. And we did all kinds of things during that 6-week period, but we were in a class, and maybe it was a fire alarm, or it was something that we needed to leave the building. And one of my fellows said, "This is really an emergency. Even Dr. Goodwin has a hair out of place." Because she never had a hair out of place. I mean, she's very sort of compact and neat and put together, and always prepared, and very very courteous in a way, like she would come into this room and say something like, "Has everyone had an opportunity to have some cake? Shall we pass it around again?" So, I mean, she would take care. Dick would come in and go, "Hey, cake." I mean, stylistically, they're very different. And he would pick up the whole plate of cake, eat it, and then probably walk around the table. "Well, yeah, have some of this." She would never do that if you want cake.
Go get it.
So stylistically, they're very different. So yes, I think in some ways it was a gift to Richard that she would spend all that time with him to have a retrospective on his life. But I also think she had her own reason to want to know the young Dick, not the man she ultimately married. I also wondered if that debate that they had all their married life about Kennedy and Johnson, if they didn't say, "Well, we'll look through these boxes and then we'll decide." I mean, this will be the fodder we use. What else appealed to you in the book? What stuck in your mind?
I don't recall the timing exactly. But Doris was quite a mini superstar on the McNeil era news.
Yes.
She was a frequent commentator.
I recall that.
And she was a prolific writer. Her historical biographies. And then she wrote the one about the Brooklyn Dodgers.
Yeah.
Wait till next year. That's the name of the book.
Yeah.
Her father taught her how to score baseball when she was like 8 or 10.
And then she got accused of plagiarism.
Yes,
Did you?
yes,
Yeah,
much later,
but plagiarism on the book,
mhm.
on that book. And all of a sudden, she wasn't on PBS anymore.
That's right.
And I wonder
And
if,
for a while, she wasn't on any. place.
right, and I wonder if that, you know, riding high as a personality, because she was, and still is, extremely talented. But she got shot down
That's a
in
great
a
point.
big crash, and I wonder if that didn't influence her, you know, inner thinking as to, well, I can't, I'm never gonna get back up there again.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. Her probably, I mean, she's got 8 or 10 books out. Probably her best known book, and if you want to read some Doris Kearns Goodwin, this is the one I would recommend to you, is No Ordinary Time. That's the Eleanor and Frank, thank you. Oh yeah, I got the wife, I forgot the president.
Eleanor, that's his name.
But you were Republican.
So, No Ordinary Time, and in this book, we know that Mr. Goodwin, or Richard, is such a wordsmith. But Doris Kearns Goodwin is not shabby with the wordsmith talent either. And it's really beautifully, beautifully written. But that's interesting because she did have a real downfall. And you know, it is something about us that we love our heroes and we love to get the gory details when they fall. I mean, we watch with, and so she did, for a while, she wasn't on any television, and that's when we see Michael Beschloff and Stephen, what was his name?
Ambrose.
Ambrose, yes, thank you. And now.
And Walter
Jim
Isaacson
Niche.
as well.
Well, Walter Isaacson is a little bit different. Beschloff and Goodwin are presidential historians. Walter Isaacson is an intellectual historian, so you know he writes about other smart people. But for a while she wasn't on anything. You wouldn't see her on television, and my guess is some of that was during this time when she's home looking through boxes.
Did she do plagiarism?
Well, you know, that's for historians especially, that's a very tough thing. And I have twice been challenged about whether I copied something. And it's not because I cheated, it's because I have a really good memory. And so, but I remember the first time I was in college, it was a blue book exam, you know, sitting there reading. And I had word for word what the answer was in the book. And the professor, I mean, he was very nice about it. The professor said, did you have something in the room with you? Did you have notes? Did you? I said, no. And he said, well, tell me again about this. And I told him, and this was like a week later, and I told him almost word for word, and he saw that it was in
there.
So it's hard because when, let's say, well, let me give an example. Maybe we're talking about poetry and whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. In the snowy, darkest evening of the year. So then I'm writing about Robert Frost. And I write the words and I said, and only he would notice that it's the dark, make note that it's the darkest evening of the year. Well, that's plagiarism. It wasn't quite intended that way. And it's very hard when you write history. My dissertation was about a man named Henry George, which I and my advisor are the two people on the planet that ever cared about it, and now he's dead. So I'm the only one that cared. But it was very hard to talk about him and not, and especially if you have a good memory. So it was a challenge. Now, it was never a challenge when she has this whole corpus, and it's only this one book that was challenged ever.
Who challenged?
But I think it was in a review, maybe. Do you remember? I think it was Kirkus Review, one of the intellectual
Yeah, I
reviews.
don't.
Together, or it just,
Well, but you know. I don't know, you know, judging people's motivation is even harder than judging plagiarism. I mean, I don't know. It's you know, Americans have a funny attitude towards celebrity. We like to build them up and we like to break them down. And so, you know, I don't know, is this somebody who is making a name for themselves? Or simply a detractor from her, and I really don't know.
Didn't she say that one of her researchers had done something strange, or she?
Well, actually, the
Came to do it.
researcher came forward and said, actually, I did that.
Hmm.
When I submitted it to notes, I didn't mark it as a quote, and so, and Doris said, no, my name is on the book.
Yeah.
Whatever happened here, I'm responsible.
Right.
And you know, she has weathered that storm. I mean, it's not, and it was her baseball book. For heaven's sake. But anyway, and now you see, Meacham, you know, who's everybody likes him and he writes beautifully and. But he seems to me a presidential pastor, not a presidential historian. I mean, I don't know that he's got the chops.
He's
to
got the
do
facts and
political.
figures. I mean, he can quote stuff and he can say, this is what happened when, this is what, you know, like I'm reading The Soul of America right now.
Beautiful
And
book.
this is very warm, his is very fact filled and it's, you know, a retelling of the tale,
Yeah.
so, but, great book.
But this whole area is what we call historiography. You know, what's the science of writing history? And by the way, that's what those fellows were called, the Goodwin Fellows were, fellows in historiography.
Rolls right off the tongue.
My mother said, what is that? So, well,
$200 a credit hour.
well, actually, we got paid. No, it was a sweetheart deal. I mean, it was kind of a cool thing.
I had an English teacher, and I've always remembered this, that she said in college, there's no such thing as good writing, there's only good rewriting.
Mhm.
Now, whether that's rewriting your own words or someone else's words, so maybe that's part of the plagiarism thing, I don't know, you know, if somebody's already stated a case that you really say, this is the strongest case, why not cite it? But maybe that was a point you.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it's Karen is right. The researcher came forward. The researcher was somebody who now is like a professor of history at Duke or something. That I did that. And I didn't do the citation. Because it had already lived in me so much that I thought of it. And then I remember her saying, oh, you know, my name's on the book. It doesn't matter what happened first, second, and third. I'm responsible. But, you know, I think that's a kind of a blip, not a serious, you know, fall from grace. And her books have done very well despite all that, including this one.
Even the baseball book is a good one.
Yeah, the baseball book is a good one. So let's get back to the Kennedy and Johnson thing. I really liked what Jane said about this book sort of rehabilitated Lyndon Johnson in her mind. Did anybody else have that, either of Kennedy or of Johnson in reading the book?
I did,
Yeah,
I
I
did,
agree.
for Johnson especially.
Good.
We lived in Texas. When Kennedy was assassinated. Well, we didn't really live there, we were in the army.
Difference.
Yeah,
One doesn't live. in
yeah.
Texas. But it was interesting, I mean, because I have these little memories of the power that LBJ and his sweet wife,
Lady Bird, yeah.
Lady Bird. And Lady Bird was
A force to be reckoned with.
an unbelievable power in Texas. And so was he. And of course he had he came up out of poverty, yeah. But he was a dirty politician right from the start. I mean, he knew how to work politics because he was a dirty politician. And
He knew how to buy votes and where to get them and.
yeah, and that was Texas. And I mean,
Still is.
I don't think Texas has changed a bit.
No.
That's right, it's good that Jen.
Till you read about Johnson, you don't know about.
know
arm
about that.
twisting.
The world didn't know about Trump. New Yorkers know what he was all about. Same as wherever they come from, the politician comes from. We're not privy to all that unless you live there and experience. I think
As the
what
Bible
they're-
says, the prophet has no honor in his own country.
There you go. Yeah.
I just remember Lady Bird as beautifying America.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I was on the Garden State.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, I worked in the White House with President Carter. And I always thought of Mrs. Carter as being in the Lady Bird Johnson mold. Because to the world, she was saccharine, sweet, courteous, welcoming, warm, and like a panted. Jimmy, it's time to go. And the president of the United States said, yes, Robert.
Right. 2 Southern ladies. Would that
Yeah.
be?
Well, I think there's something to that, to Baptist ladies, I don't, I'll tell you this. It's not my culture. So I don't quite get it. And, it's some kind of economy, maybe even of between husbands and wives that is a generation before my generation. It's
I
just
agree.
not like,
I agree.
I never thought of myself as being in charge of when my husband ought to go someplace or not go someplace.
I think that's what the 60s did. The
Mhm.
later 60s did change that.
I have one more thing that I thought was interesting. Is when he would hold meetings, it reminded me of Churchill. Because Churchill used to hold meetings in his bathtub. Johnson sounded sort of the same way, wherever he was, whatever he had on or didn't have on. But we're gonna have a meeting.
Yeah, well, skinny dipping with Bill Moyers,
Yeah.
Bill and Judith Moyers became friends during the Carter administration. Judith was served with me on a commission for the Carter administration. And they kindly invited me to preach at their church, which was in New City, on Long Island. And I mean, it's pretty daunting. Judith Moyers, she's the producer of the Bill Moyers Hour. I mean, so she's not
So that was the same as the newscaster, Bill Moyers. or-
Yeah,
Okay.
same
all right.
thing.
Oh, so I tried to look at the resemblance. and I
Yeah.
couldn't see it.
Yeah, that's Bill Moyers. Actually, Bill Moyers heard about the assassination. He was in some other Texas town like Austin or something, no. At that particular time, and he called in Johnson, said, come to me. And so he came to Love Field, flew to Love Field to be on the plane to come back to Washington. Now, what was I saying about it?
Shooting Duquesne.
Oh, yes, yeah, thank you. I went to preach, and Bill and Judith had failed to tell me that one of the other parishioners in this particular church, UCC Church on Long Island, was Fred Friendly, who's a great hero of mine, you know, Fred Friendly.
The radio guy.
Yeah, well, yeah, and he's the one that passed the note to Edward R. Murrow. And Edward R. Murrow said, sir, do you have no decency, to Joe McCarthy? So, I mean, that's a whole bunch of both. Anyway, so I went there, then we went back to Bill and Judith's home to have lunch or brunch or something. And Bill was telling this hilarious story about skinny dipping in the White House pool, and they didn't much, these guys didn't much mind, and a lot of these guys had been in the service, and yeah, I mean, it just really wasn't a thing at all. But Lady Bird would come in and stand at some length. And all trying to walk. And so Bill told this hilarious story. Anyway, so one of the cataclysmic things here is the assassinations of Martin, of John Kennedy, of Robert. And by the way, Peter Edelman, you know, you often see a picture of Bob Kennedy lying on the floor of the ambassador in the kitchen in the Ambassador Hotel, and there's a man leaning over him, and that man is Peter Edelman, husband of Marion Wright Edelman. So that's there's a set of supporting actors here. Moyers, Edelman, you know, all these folks who were young people then, Doris herself. And all of that energy after the assassination of John Kennedy really got directed toward fulfilling his dreams. And I remember as a kid being very impressed with that, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I found that inspiring, and I think they did. So then but it's Dick Goodwin who pulls that image together and says, this is a great society. Not the New Deal, not the old deal, not the newer deal, the
Great Society.
newest deal, but not a good society, but a great society. And I've read other places, de Tocqueville, you know, who writes, he's the Frenchman that came during the
Revolution.
thank you. And he writes, he's amazed by this American experiment, and he writes in there, America is great because she is good. And if she ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And Goodwin, I have read elsewhere that Goodwin, I think that's in Sam Proctor's book, his memoir, that it was that was in Dick Goodwin's mind when he coined this term, the Great Society. Now, where that linked up to, for instance, President Carter, the flagship program of the war on poverty was the program known as Head Start, which recognized that little children, when they got to kindergarten, there were children who had been exposed to books, knew maybe a few letters, maybe even knew all their letters. And there were children who had had very little adult supervision and were kind of like wild animals. They didn't know to put food on a plate. They didn't know what this was. They didn't know how to focus their attention. And somebody said, look at me, eyes front. You know, I mean, they had no idea. And early childhood specialists said, it's almost impossible to remediate that stuff when they get to be 10. We gotta do it. And the way to do it is to give them a head start. And that became the Head Start program, which is how I got involved in this, because I was doing child advocacy on behalf of the National Council of Churches. And that's how I got into the White House situation with the Carters. Those programs, the very first programs to have Pell Grants and student loans to go to college. What else? The first serious health program for seniors as a companion program to the Social Security program, which of course was Roosevelt's program. But that whole fabric, you know, we like to think, as Marilyn said earlier, what would have happened if Kennedy had lived? Here's another thing to think about. What would have happened if the Great Society legislation had never been enacted? Where would we be? And I have to think less well off than we are. The example I like to give, and I used to give when I made speeches about such matters, is it's very interesting. Any middle-class kid goes to a pediatrician, and one of the first things a pediatrician does when the baby is born is either use a pacifier or put their finger in the baby's mouth and ring a bell behind their head. They can hear it, they stop sucking for a second. They have a startle response. They can't hear, they just keep right on sucking, and that's an indicator that you need to get a hearing test. And you know, you can do a hearing test with a baby, like raise your hand. When you hear something in your left ear, are you listening? So you have to find some unobtrusive means. But I always used to like to use the example, if that can be identified in an 18-month-old, say, who's just, and one of the ways you identify it then is as they begin to form words, the words don't sound right. Ma, not mom, mama, but ma. That's what they're hearing. That's what they're repeating. So if you can identify it at 18 months, there's an implant. It's actually incredibly simple. It's a platinum wire that's attached to a bone and the eardrum. And it takes the place of the eardrum. It responds to, and it restores about 80% of the hearing. If you can do that at 18 months, you remediate. If it waits till the child's in first grade, which is the first time by law your child has to be in school. You know, kindergarten was not required in those days. By the time the child is 6 years old, the people around that child with hearing limitation have decided the kid is stubborn, obstinate, won't listen. Others have decided, and they act on that. Get tough with that kid because won't do what he's told. Others have decided the kid is dumb. It's just he did not too bright, that's why he's just not bright. Worse yet. The kid has decided. There's something wrong with me. I'm not very good. Well, at 10, we can still do the implant. But we don't know much about how to remediate the spirit once that's broken, the self-esteem. And so I think about Head Start as the program that saved children from lives of despair, really, because it identified problems very, very early on. And hearing is just the one that, for whatever reason, spoke to me. So I think about, what do you think it would be like had we not done the Great Society legislation?
Well, I don't think Nixon would have carried the torch, that's the doggone sure, that's my own opinion. But, I mean, it's hard to even say whether Kennedy would have been reelected had he lived, because his popularity was starting to go down.
Well, and the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right. Although the Cuban Missile Crisis brought his stature up, but,
Ultimately.
yes.
Yeah. but
If
at
you
the
weren't
beginning-
scared to death,
Right,
if you lived to see the outcome, yeah. No, I think, you know, it is true of Teddy White's assumption that Theodore White, the making of the president, 1960. Teddy White's right. The clock stopped. And so we remember Camelot.
mhm.
But Camelot could look like an out of control frat party had it gone on for another 2 years. Think Marilyn Monroe, Frank Sinatra. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of
There, if
stuff
there'd
going
been social media back then,
Yeah.
it would have been a disaster.
on. Well, I think that's probably true whenever social media shows up, there's gonna be a disaster. Okay, it's after 12 now. Next week, I'd like to talk about those times, the 60s, and these times. And we'll have the benefit of having seen the debate this night. Or heard about it. I don't know if you're planning to watch it, but at least you'll have heard about it. But I hope you'll agree that in this election year, it's well to think of these things. And to think of these things in this kind of a context, not in a, you know, head bang. In that regard, I want to say to you again, we're planning to have a Souls to the Polls drive. If you are willing to drive people to the polls on election day, please see me so I can write your name down. If you know of people not associated with the church necessarily, I mean, they could be, but it doesn't have to be. Just anybody that needs to get to a poll. Sometimes people who, for instance, walk with a walker or a stick or whatever, or have other kinds of limitations, don't want to go to the polls, didn't get around to getting an absentee ballot. They don't want to go to the polls because you have to park so far away. And so one of the ideas of Souls to the Polls is, you know, we'll drive you right up to the doorway. So that you, so let me know if you have names on either side of that.
Fun fact, starting with Kennedy, the next 6 presidents were all in the Navy, all served in the Navy.
Well,
Fun fact.
I'll give you a little story for that fun fact. The last time, and I'm sure it will be the last time we ever have a reunion of the Carter White House staff, was some years ago. I think it was when Schwarzkopf, remember General Schwarzkopf? He died, and we all went to the funeral. And then Ham Jordan, who was the press guy in our administration, has a farm in Virginia. So the next day we had a kind of an ox roast and a kind of a reunion at his farm. And President Carter and Ms. Carter were there. And of course, they had sat in the front row as in the National Cathedral, you know, as with all the presidents and so on. And at the end of the service, because Schwarzkopf was army, it played the battle hymn of the Republic. And the next day, we were all sitting out on the lawn and eating this thing. And I've never called the Carters anything but Mrs. Carter and President Carter. But in that setting, we tend to call him boss, you know, especially Ham and those guys. Jody Powell and Ham, and the people that are really close to him call him boss. And he said, hey, boss, you know, that I was pretty good send off for an army guy. And he said, and you know, that's just the way the president spoke at it. He says, well, it was fine. It was fine. I like to battle him in the public. But when it comes to me, I just want the chosen end to be anchors away. All right, thank you very much. We can't, it's just a click of a button.